Hi guys, I'm Jeff. I'm the winemaker for Tractor's Vineyard, and welcome to our latest virtual wine tasting. Haven't recorded one of these for a while. I've been doing real live wine tastings for a while, so might be a bit rusty, but we had to update the range that we're sending out to you. So we've got a whole lot of really exciting wines for you tonight. Now, a few things before we kick in. Remember, you can pause this, you can jump forward, you can jump back, so you can sort of design your own wine tasting as you will. Please drink at your own pace. I'm going to work through fairly quickly. Like, I don't rush through the wines. There's always a bit of storytelling, always a little bit of talking about at the same time. But it's amazing how those sample bottles, you probably end up with about 50 or 60 ml in your glass, and that's actually a fair bit. So I'd recommend only putting a tiny bit in your glass so that you can keep up with the tasting and you don't end up trying to scull it all and move on. As I said, I do try and tell a little bit of a story about our wines, a little bit about everything as we go. So just because I've moved on to the next wine, don't panic. You don't have to scull the wine you're on, because there's plenty of time to move along at your own pace. And but let's get into it, because that's why we're here, tasting wine. So we're going to start off with our Sauvignon Blanc. If you haven't heard about Tractor's Vineyard, well, pour yourself a glass and start tasting, and I'll tell you a little bit about our background. So Tractor's Vineyard, we're based in Barrel in the Southern Highlands. We run our vineyard all biodynamically, and then we run sheep through the vineyard for the entire growing period. And that means we're using the tractor about 60% less, and that's where the name Tractorless Vineyard comes from. So our whole approach is a real holistic, natural, natural systems to solve any issues we have. So previously, the reason we got into sheep is we actually had a caterpillar problem on the farm. And the biodynamic philosophy says that if you've got insect problems on your farm, it's because you don't have enough animals and your balances are out. So we started experimenting with sheep, and we'll talk about that a little bit later when we get to some of our red wines. But as a result, we've solved our caterpillar problem. And putting my scientific hat back on, what we can see is that the moths are laying eggs all through the vineyard, but they also lay eggs in all other broadleaf, so clovers, medics, and that sort of thing. The sheep eat all the clovers and medics, and so they're eating half the eggs. So that means that we're not getting as many caterpillars. So we still have them in the vineyard, but they're not in any sort of problem or plague level now. And this is a perfect example of how these natural systems work. And so that's how we approach everything now. So as I said, we're going to start with our Sauvignon Blanc. Now, I'm generally not a massive fan of Sauvignon Blanc. I guess we've had it thrown in our face for so long, especially from New Zealand, these really tight, acidic sort of wines. And so I really wanted to showcase what Sauvignon Blanc can do. So I actually let ours ripen probably a little bit, maybe 2-3 weeks more than a traditional New Zealand style Sauv Blanc, or those really, those really punchy acidic Sauv Blancs. I just let them ripen a little bit more, and that kind of mellows out the flavors. So you get these more soft, round sort of flavors to the wine. Now, what I've done is I've actually made the exact same grapes 3 different ways. And it's a great example of what the winemaker can do in the process. So this first one we're tasting is probably the most, I say traditional, but probably post-industrial revolution traditional way of making Sauvignon Blanc. It's pressed off nice and early, nice and cold into a tank. It's 100% stainless steel fermentation, so that preserves that crispness, that freshness. And we're trying to create this really clean and lean sort of style of wine. One of the things you'll notice with this Sauv Blanc, get little hints of like capsicum, which we'll call is a slightly greener character. So as your grapes progress, they go from these sort of green capsicum flavors and into like passion fruits and more tropical aromas. So we're just pushing past those capsicum into those tropical. And that's when I like to harvest them, because they're kind of a bit more mellowed out, a bit more relaxed. So that's our first one. Now, when I harvested these grapes, they all came to the winery at the exact same time. And we pressed off all the skins and seeds from the juice, from the grape juice. And half of it went to stainless steel. And that's the wine you just tried then. The second half I put into oak barrels. Now, there's a famous region of France called Fume. And this region of France is known for making these Sauvignon Blancs with this beautiful sort of matchsticky, flinty character to the wines. And for years, New World winemakers, so Australia, New Zealand, America, we all thought that the way they got these characters into their wine was by fermenting them in oak. So when we ferment a Sauvignon Blanc in oak, we call it fume. Now, the interesting thing is they actually don't always ferment it in oak over and for their fume. It's on this riverbank, and this riverbank's got quite pebbly sort of soils, and they naturally get that flinty, matchsticky character in the wine without the use of oak. But regardless of this, we still call fumes Sauvignon Blancs that fermented with oak. So this next one we're going to try is our fume. So it's the exact same juice, exact same grapes. Literally the only difference is it's in an oak barrel rather than a stainless steel tank. And the first thing you notice, it kind of has a bit more of a vanilla-y character from the oak. We get a little bit more texture in the mouth. And I love texture. Like, I love to be able to feel the wine in my mouth. Like, I want to smell it, taste it, and feel it. So I'm a huge fan of texture. So we're starting to see a little bit of that texture. But one of the really cool things that we see here is there's a winemaking technique called micro-ox, or micro-oxygenation. And what it is letting in small amounts of oxygen into the ferment whilst the wine's fermenting. And an oak barrel will naturally do this. So I can spend $20,000, $30,000 on a special micro-ox machine to let in the oxygen in the ferment. Or I can buy myself an oak barrel, which has the pores in there, and they let the oxygen in. And it does something really interesting to the flavors. So that first Sauv Blanc that we had this kind of like bit of a capsicum-y edge. And we consider that a green flavor. And as a winemaker, if I want to take green flavors and change them into more fruity flavors, then what I do is micro-ox. And this is a great example of what will happen to a wine if we micro-ox. And you'll see this fume, it almost tastes more fruity, even though it's the exact same grapes. And that's a perfect example of what this micro-oxygenation does. This is actually probably one of our most popular whites at the moment, is the micro-ox. Micro-ox Fume Blanc. And you really get that sort of vanilla residual sort of coming through. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of a style of winemaking called orange winemaking. And no, that's not from the region Orange, although I love their wines. It's the way we used to make wine thousands of years ago. Or we used to make white wine thousands of years ago. It's the way we still make white wine in Eastern Europe. And what it is, we're fermenting it with the skins. And when we ferment the white wine with the skins, we get this real sort of tannic texture to it, and we're extracting a lot more of those flavors. And we quite often extract a lot of the color out of the skins. And we often end up with a wine called an orange wine because it has this orangey color to it from the skins. So the next wine we're going to taste tonight is our skin contact, or our orange Sauvignon Blanc. Now, I've actually spent a long time over in Eastern Europe, and so I have a lot of experience making these styles of wine. And it's a tendency to, when you first start making them, you're worried about extracting too much of that tannin, too much of that grit. And so what you do is you leave it with the skins for a week or two, and then you think, oh my God, I've got to get it off the skins, and we press it off to get it off the skins and remove the wine from it to try and reduce those sort of tannic characters. Now, the problem doing this is when you press it off early, we're ending up with very short tannins in the wine. And short tannins are a more astringent, almost bitter tannin in the wine. And so when we see those tannins, it's being pressed off. And what we want to do is actually make those tannins nice and long, so they're really a bit more soft and dusty style tannins. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but we're leaving the wine longer will actually fine up. So this wine of ours spends 10 months sitting with the skins. And what happens for the first 3 months, all those tannins come out. And when you taste it at about that 3-month stage, the wine tastes absolutely awful. Like it's like bitter and astringent and terrible. But as it sits there longer, those tannins, there's so many in there, they start rebinding up to all the skins and seeds, but at the same time, they start lengthening out. They're joining together and polymerizing out. And so what happens by the time we get to that 10-month stage, a lot of those tannins have fallen out. And the ones that are still there are more of a dusty, soft tannin rather than that sort of bitter, hard tannin. So I love this style of wine. One, because it reminds me, going back to heritage, you know, my blood's from Eastern Europe. It also has that texture. And I said earlier, I'm a huge fan of texture. Now, this makes it more of a food wine. So I absolutely love this wine with like some barbecued pork or anything that you caramelize, get those caramelizing flavors. It gives a kind of sweetness to the wine. I also love it because of that tannin and that texture. Those things are antioxidant and antimicrobial. So this wine, I don't have to add any preservative. So all of our wines are organic level preservative, but this skins contact, we don't add anything. So no preservative added at all. Now, you may have seen terms like sulfur-free wine or those sort of things. There's no such thing, I'm afraid. Yeast will naturally produce about 50 parts per million of sulfur during the ferment. So you cannot get a wine without sulfur, but you can have wines with nothing added. And this is an example of a wine with nothing added. And because of that texture, we can safely hold that wine without it going oxidized or anything. Another thing you'll notice is we haven't filtered that wine. So by not filtering it and leaving that yeast in there, that also gives us the ability to gobble up any oxygen that is hanging around that gets into the bottle. So that's our orange wine. Great match, as I said, with the barbecued pork and that sort of thing. I also really love it. It seems to handle a bit of spice. Now, spice is one of those things that's really hard to match with wines. And this skins contact Sauv Blanc goes quite well with spice. The other one that goes quite well with spice is the next one we're going to look at, which is our Pinot Gris. Our Pinot Gris, this is actually quite a special wine for us, our Pinot Gris. We'd normally try a Grigio and a Gris at this stage because I love comparing the two and showing people the actual difference between the two, because we really don't get to see the difference in Australia that often. Unfortunately, we don't have any Grigio or Gris left from well, normally we'd be selling our 2020s, but there's no such thing as 2020 wines because of the bushfires. So we got smoke taint in all of our wines. The whole region didn't harvest anything in 2020 because of smoke taint. So smoke taint is a really crazy thing. It's like when you taste the grapes after there's been smoke around, they taste fine. When you make wine out of it, it tastes great. When you put the wine into bottle, fantastic. 6 months in bottle, tastes like an ashtray. And it's not like a nice sort of whiskey style of smoke. It's like an acrid, sour, like terrible tasting smoke. And it's really interesting. What happens is the smoke actually binds to sugars in the grape. And those, when it's bound up, you can't taste it. And as it ferments, it still stays like this. And then as it ages, the bond slowly weakens. And it's in this weak state. Now, when we taste it in that weak state, there's an enzyme in our saliva that actually breaks the bond. And when that bond is broken, that's when we taste the smoke character. Now, 20% of people in the world do not have that enzyme. So if we could find those 20% of people, we can give them all our smoke-tainted wines. Unfortunately, we can't. We don't have a system for it at the moment. So what happens is quite often wineries in those smoky years will try and make something and sell it very quick, because as long as you can try and sell it before 6 months, you can usually, the wine hasn't, that bond hasn't loosened enough to release those flavors. But the longer they sit in the bottle, the more those bonds loosen. Sometimes they even break then, and it just gets like worse and worse and worse and worse. So prior to 2018, we couldn't test for it. So you could have a couple of days of smoke, think it's okay, make all this wine, bottle all this wine, put it in the market, and then 6 months later, it's terrible. And it's like really devastating, one, for your brand, but also just for your business in general, creating all these wines that taste terrible. So Australia actually invented the technique that we now use around the world for testing for smoke taint. And what we have to do is a couple of weeks before harvest, we've got to harvest some grapes. We've got to freeze them directly. And then within a day, we've got to get them to a laboratory who can do the testing. Now, the only lab in Australia is down in Adelaide. And you can imagine during the bushfires of 2020, the whole East Coast was on fire. So every single wine region, the whole East Coast, had to get grapes to Adelaide to get tested within a day. And so we all had these local representatives, and we would harvest some grapes, freeze them, give them to the local rep, who would then the next day take an esky of frozen grapes to the local to the closest airport for us at Sydney. They'd then fly to Adelaide. They'd hand the esky over to the lab staff in the airport, get back on the plane and fly back to Sydney. And this was being done all down the East Coast of Australia. So it was an absolutely amazing logistical feat. And as a result, we get a number. Now, me personally, I wouldn't make a wine with a smoke taint level over about 80. They sometimes push it up to 100, but I'm quite sensitive to it. And so I don't like going above 80. The lowest smoke taint level in our region was 300. So 3 times the minimum, or the 3 times the maximum level to make wine. So we didn't make anything. But it's a flip side of that is we actually bottled some Pinot Gris into these little bottles, these little 375 bottles, specifically for accommodation. Now, because of all the COVID and accommodation being shut, we have a lot of these older bottles. So this 2017 is what we've got in our tasting at the moment. And it's a really special year for us. The first thing, we often don't get to try slightly older Pinot Gris. But when they age, we get this beautiful kind of beeswaxy character coming into the wine. And you definitely see it in the 17. The other thing about the 17 is, I said it's a special year to us. And that's because when you convert biodynamic, the vines are so used to having pesticide and fungicide sprayed on them that when you take those things away, the vines just get sick. And they get sick and they get sick and they get sick until they build up their natural immunity. And this usually takes about 4 to 5 years. So 2017 was year 5 for us. We'd lost a lot of grapes along the way. It was quite a wet year. So in 2017, we got 30 days of rain over harvest. And a lot of the region didn't harvest any of their grapes because of a fungal disease called botrytis. Now, we used to get botrytis every single year. And in 2017, it was amazing. We actually got no botrytis at all. And we hadn't sprayed, we hadn't done anything. And it was like a bit of an aha moment. And I'm really lucky now because I actually get to talk to a lot of old school viticulturalists. So 10 years ago, I was sort of viewed as the crazy hippie up on the hill. And now I actually sit on a couple of local associations and New South Wales level and the Australia-wide level on sustainability. And so I'm advising a lot of the industry. And what we've found is these old guys said that we never had botrytis. It's never a big problem. What we find is when we start seeing a little bit of botrytis in the vineyard, we started spraying for it. And when we spray for botrytis, we wipe out all the microbes. And botrytis is quite a hardy fungal disease, but it's a very weak colonizer. So when we spray, we kill everything else. And the most hardy, botrytis, comes back after the spray. Now, when it comes back after the spray, guess what? It's got nothing to outcompete it because there's nothing else there. And so it gets worse and worse. So you have to spray again, and then you have to spray again, then you have to spray again, and then it gets resistant to that chemical. So you got to change chemicals and spray again and spray again. You get stuck in this cycle of spraying. So when we go biodynamic, what's happening is we're letting the natural bacteria, like a lot of trichodermas and funguses and stuff, start coming into the system. And they will colonize the surfaces first, and then there's no way the botrytis can colonize. And that's what's happening when we convert biodynamic. So after 4 years of doing that, finally in year 5, we get this result where we no longer have botrytis in the vineyard. And this, you know, it's a bit of a catch-22 because we made a lot of dessert wine, and the last wine we're tasting today is our dessert wine. And we need botrytis to make that. And now we can't make that anymore. So the fact that I can't make one of our wines because it is kind of, I don't mind. We're going to try planting a little separate block away from the main vineyard that we're going to try inoculating with botrytis to see if we can remake that botrytis wine. So that's our 2017 Pinot Gris. Now, normally our Pinot Gris will be a little bit richer and robust because our Grigios, Italian style, tight, zippy, crisp. Gris, French style, big, round, voluptuous. Unfortunately, because of that cooler, wet season in 17, this wine probably sits between the green Grigio sort of spectrum. So that's all the white wines I've got for you today, but it's winter down here, so I'm into reds. And the first red we're going to look at, we call Little Beau Peep. And I mentioned before how important the sheep were to our operation, and they're actually one of the reasons we're so sustainable. They are saving us 60% of our tractor use. One of the most, I guess, expensive parts of going biodynamic or organic is actually managing the grass. And that's because we can't herbicide, which means we've got to spend a lot of time mulching, whippersnipping, cultivating to manage the grass. And that's a very expensive way to manage grass. So a lot of bigger vineyards don't go that way because it's just too expensive. The sheep now do it all for us for free. And as I mentioned earlier, we originally got into the sheep because of the caterpillar problem. And first up, we tried a breed of sheep called a Dorper. I thought Dorpers, they'll be fantastic, you know, easy to look after. They've got great meat. You don't have to shear them, so their wool just sheds. So I thought, perfect, let's get some Dorpers. And we got these Dorpers. And we thought they were great. Well, a Dorper, kind of like a goat, and they ate half the vineyard. So that experiment didn't work very well. I actually grew up on a sheep farm. I grew up on a merino farm. So next up, we tried merinos. And biggest difference between Dorpers and merinos is a Dorper is what we call a browsing sheep. So they kind of look everywhere for food and they'll just eat whatever they can see. A merino is a grazing sheep. So they only look inside their feed zone for food, and they won't look outside of their feed zone until they've run out of food in their feeding zone. So the merinos, they kind of worked. The grapevine sat here, which was outside of their feeding zone. The bunches hung down just inside of their feeding zone. And what we did is we ran these 2 electrical wires underneath the bunches to stop them from eating the grapes. And this worked quite well. The problem that year was that when the electricity went out for a couple of hours, it's amazing how many grapes a sheep can eat in 2 hours. So we started looking around, and eventually we found this rare breed of sheep called a Hampshire Down. And I thought these sheep are grazers like a merino. They probably suit our climate a bit better here in the Highlands with cold and wet, hence being called the Highlands. And it's a UK breed. So we got some Hampshire Downs. Now, the biggest difference between a merinos and a Hampshire Down is both are grazing sheep. The Hampshire Down is 2 inches shorter than a Merino. So with the Merino, the bunches are here inside their feeding zone. With the Hampshire down, they're here outside their feeding zone. So it means we can run these sheep through the vineyard for the whole growing period. Now, this has solved our caterpillar problem. It has also solved our grass problem. So now, instead of having to mow and herbicide the vineyard every week or two, I now go to the vineyard every 3 or 4 days. I open a gate, I call out, "Suki, suki, suki," and all the sheep run into the next paddock, and then I close the gate. And so that's how we manage it now. Now, this has had so many great effects. It means that we can now regeneratively graze and manage our pastures, which are in between the grapevines. So we're capturing more carbon, we're putting in fertility in the soil. It also means that we now have another line of income, or 2 lines, wool and meat, from the exact same block of land. So this system with running the sheep through has fundamentally changed biodynamics and organics. You know, what was originally a philosophical choice to go that way, but it was way more expensive, is now actually a cheaper, more efficient way to run a vineyard than an industrial way. Now, the challenge is for us, and also for this being taken up by the broader wine industry, is that the Hampshire Down sheep is quite rare. So we need 300 to run our vineyard. We started with 10, we now have 100. Last year, I tried to buy a whole heap, and I found out that we're one of the bigger breeders in Australia. So there's a couple of really big breeders, but then it's a very small level. So one of the challenges we have is getting those numbers up. So back onto the wine, Little Beau Peep. So this is a wine that was inspired by the Beaujolais region of France. And the Beaujolais region of France makes these beautiful, delicate red wines, which I love in summertime because you can chill them. So I originally made this wine to be chilled in summer. And we use the same winemaking technique as they do in Beaujolais, which is called carbonic maceration. And what it is we're fermenting the berries whole. And when we're fermenting them whole, we're extracting all the flavor. We get a little bit less color, but we also get this nice like softness because we're not contacting as much of the juice with the seeds and the inner part of the skin. It means we're not extracting all that tannin. We also don't put it in oak. So it means that you end up with really soft, sort of juicy wine. And when you chill it, you don't see that tannin. So, you know, if you chill a normal red, that tannin sticks out a bit. If you chill this, you don't see it. So I originally made it to be chilled in summer, but it actually drinks really well at room temperature in winter as well. So when it's chilled, you'll see a lot more of the Grenache characters, which is those sort of raspberry characters. And then as it warms up, we start seeing more and more of the Mourvedre. And the Mourvedre has this more meaty, sort of savory pepperiness about it. And so we start seeing that when it warms up. So in summer, what I'll do is I'll actually fill up a glass, a nice big cold glass, and then I'll slowly let it warm up. And so I see that evolution from those nice raspberry characters into those sort of more Mourvedre-y, peppery, meaty characters. Now, it's not a true Beaujolais because, well, one, it's not from the Beaujolais region, but also traditionally Beaujolais wines are made with a variety called Gamay. So we didn't have Gamay, so I've used Grenache and Mourvedre. And so we just call it Little Beau Peep. So it's just a Beaujolais inspired wine. So that's Little Beau Peep. Sorry, I had to deal with some noise outside. Yeah, so beautiful Beaujolais inspired. I love it. It's beautiful, delicate wine. I'm drinking more and more of it over the winter as well, just because I think it's a great soft wine. Next up, we're going to try a Nebbiolo. So I don't know if you've ever tried a Nebbiolo. You may have tried it and not known. This is the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So Little Beau Peep is all about fruit and softness. Nebbiolo is like licorice and tobacco. So it's still quite a delicate wine, but just it's more of those savory flavors. I love it because it's not fruity. You know, I love fruit, but, you know, Shiraz, Merlot, Cabernet, you know, all of these varieties are quite fruit-driven varieties. And sometimes I just want something a bit different. And so Nebbiolo is my something a bit different wine. One of the confusing things is that Europeans love to name their wines after the region, whereas in Australia, we name the wines after the variety of the grapes that they're made from. So in Italy, this wine would be called Barolo, and Barolo is the region. And in that region, most of the grapes they grow are Nebbiolo grapes. So in Australia, we call it Nebbiolo. Now, traditionally in Barolo, the Nebbiolos are quite tannic and they take a long time to settle down. I find that in Australia, our Nebbiolos are a little bit softer. And so I spend a lot of time trying to build up the structure of this wine to make it a little bit more Italian-like. So this actually spends 3 months sitting with its skins to really get to that maximum level of tannic structure when we pull it out. We also let it sit in older oak barrels for a bit longer, trying to get some of that nice tobacco-y character into the wine. So traditionally, they'll describe Nebbiolo as rose and tar. And I actually think that's a really good description because you get these beautiful sort of red floral characters about it. But then you get this like licoricey tobacco character in there as well. And so I love Nebbiolo. Really great match with like truffles, salamis, pizza. Love Nebbiolo with a pizza and Nebbiolo, perfect match. But it's an interesting variety. We're starting to see more and more of it in Australia. I think a lot of these Italian varieties like Nebbiolo really suit our climate, and we're really starting to see them pop up around regions. So they're definitely worth looking out for. It's not such a crazy grape that if you went into a bottle shop and asked for it, they'd say, I don't know, we don't have any Australian Nebs. More than likely, they will definitely have a number of Australian Nebbiolos that you can choose from. So it's an interesting variety to start to explore. The next two are really interesting to compare. So if you happen to have a second glass, then go and grab it. Doesn't matter if you don't. So we have designed this tasting so that you don't have to rinse your glasses between wines because we just put a stronger wine in after the one before and after the one before. But the next two are our Shirazes. Now, I've always wanted to, Shiraz has been part of my history for day one. I finished year 12 and I didn't know whether I wanted to be a winemaker or an outdoor education teacher. And so my dad convinced me that what I should do over my summer holiday break is get a job at one of the local wineries to see if I liked it and whether I should be a winemaker. And I thought, that's a great idea, Dad. So I went and got a job at a winery in Canberra called Clonakilla. And Clonakilla are famous for their cool climate Shirazes. And I ended up working there for 3 years whilst I studied by correspondence winemaking. And they definitely got me hooked on winemaking for sure. Anyway, I love Australian Shiraz, and I've tried really different techniques for making Shiraz across my years, French techniques, stem contact, skin to all these different things. But Aussie Shiraz, I just like to leave alone. It's got such beautiful structure and beautiful flavors for cool climate Shiraz that I leave it alone. And these two wines are a really great example of what will happen if you have patience. And no one has patience. I think 96% of wines are drunk within 24 hours of them being purchased. So if you keep wines, then you're part of the top 4%. 2015 and 2017 were very similar years. And so I think these two are a really great example of what will happen as you age a wine. So 17 is the one we're going to taste first, which is our softer, earlier one. It's interesting with cool climate Shirazes. What we find is as they age, their tannins do soften a bit, but the actual wines themselves become bigger and more complex. So you'll see with this 2017, it is a beautiful example of a cool climate Shiraz. I don't do much. It's a really hands-off winemaking. We de-stem it, ferment it without its stems for 2 or 3 weeks, press it off into oak, leave it for oak for 12 months, and then put it on the bottle. It's a really easy standard winemaking. But when you get the regions right and the grape varieties suit the terroir, you get this beautiful, the first thing you see on that 17 is beautiful lifted violets. There's delicate raspberries. It's got a real ethereal sort of character to the wine itself. One of the things that I'm really looking for in a cool climate Shiraz is the tannin structure. And what you'll feel is if you really think about where those furry tannins are, you get this nice line down the middle of the tongue, and it's a nice continual backbone to that wine. And one of the things that, in a lesser quality cool climate region, when you get Shiraz, that backbone goes through a little bit of a dip in the middle, and it gets this kind of like big at the back and then a dip in the middle and big at the front. And it's what we call a bony structure. And so when you get that nice linear middle to it, to me, that's that beauty of these cool climate Shirazes. So that's the 17, which is nice and delicate and ethereal. Now, if you were to wait 2 years, I think the 17 will be very similar to the 15. So both of these wines at the same age were really similar, which is why I love comparing the two. So if you've got a second glass, have a look at the 17. Have a look at the 15. So the 17, really nice and delicate. As we age, those tannins soften, and what you'll see, it becomes deeper and more charry and bigger sort of wine. So I actually drink more of the 17 on a day-to-day basis. But if I'm having like a big steak or something like that, some sort of big, heavy red meat type meal, I'll actually go to 15 because it's just got a little bit more of those balls and that round sort of depth and charriness. And it's a really cool example of what will happen. So you can get the 17 and age it, and it will be like the 15, or you can let us age it and you'll pay more and get the 15. So I like how wines age, and it's something that we don't get to see that often. And so we try and do it in-house. Now, with our wine club, for example, we try and hold back about 20% of the cases when we send out like a number of our aged wines on our releases. So it's something that I like to sort of show people, a lot of like we compare those 3 different Sauv Blancs, we compare Grigio and Gris. I really love sharing my experience and history of wine with everyone. So we do these different styles and techniques. I guess one of the other things you'll notice about our full range is they're very different. Every single wine we make has a very different winemaking technique and a very different reason behind it. And quite often you'll see wineries that make wine, all their whites similar and all their reds similar. But, Tractola's Vineyard was originally a side project for me. I was doing a lot of contract work, a lot of consulting work, and I kind of got bored of making the same wine, the same thing, being driven by the market. And I had all these crazy, wild ideas, which, you can't really try those ideas on other people's grapes in case they go wrong. And so I started Tractola's more as a way to keep me interested and excited about winemaking, and it's sort of grown and grown and grown. And it's probably about 60% of what I do now is Tractola's, which is quite exciting. And as you'll see, every wine's very different. Every wine's made for a specific reason with specific winemaking. It's crazy in the winery and vintage because there's all these different techniques going on, but it's actually really interesting at the same time because you are doing so many different things. And we do get a lot of international winemakers come and work with us because they get to see these things in the winery all happening at once. So that's our 2 Shirazes, and you'll see what age in a bottle can do. Next up is something really interesting. So we call this our Post Mac Cab Sav. And when I was at uni, I was actually really lucky because I think there was about 10 people doing the degree when I went through uni. And then there was like 200 or something 2 years after me. But what it meant was one of my lecturers, Nick Bulliard, who's a master of wine, when he wanted the 10 of us to taste wine, he could just bring a bottle from his cellar. When there's 200 people, he couldn't just bring a bottle from his cellar. So I got to try some amazing wines. And Nick tells this fantastic story where he was walking down the street of Adelaide and he walked past this old skip bin out the front of a pub that was being renovated. And he just happened to look in this skip bin and he's seen this bottle of wine. So he's jumped in there, he grabbed this bottle, he brought it into uni, and we tasted it. And it turned out to be a 1956 McGill's Burgundy. So the McGill vineyard is the original Penfolds vineyard before they built half of Adelaide on top of it. It was about a 50-year-old wine when we tried it, and it was just amazing. And if you've ever tried really old wines, it's crazy. We're talking like flavors like soy sauce, fish sauce, fermenting guava, and you just think, wow, you're definitely not selling that wine. It doesn't sound great. But the way those flavors interact is unbelievable. And it kind of reminds me when I was at uni, I had this friend of mine who was studying to be a chef. And one day, I remember one morning he said to me, "Oh, Jeff, I'm going to make you French toast." I'm like, "Yeah, cool, right. Never heard of it. Cook me French toast. Sounds great." Anyway, I watched him, and he's got the egg and cooked up the egg with the bread, and then he's putting bacon on it and some banana and maple syrup. And I'm looking at it going, bacon, egg, banana, and maple syrup. What the hell are you giving me here? I'm like, all right. And I tasted it, and it was incredible. You've got that sweetness and that saltiness and the savoriness, and how all those flavors interact is just beautiful. And this reminds me of really old wines. You've got all these crazy flavors, but the way they interact is just phenomenal. And you just get all these levels of complexity. And so I've been obsessed. I've wanted to make a wine that's going to age 100 years. And when we look around the world at who's famous for making wines that last 100 years, well, the region that consistently comes up is Bordeaux. And the Bordelais created this technique that we call post-ferment maceration. And what it is a lot of people don't realize, but if I take a red grape and I squeeze it, the juice and the pulp inside is actually white. So to create a red wine, we need to ferment it with the skins. And so we're extracting all those color from the skins. And that process takes about 3 or 4 weeks. If I then leave that wine sitting with the skins after the ferment, we call it post-ferment maceration. And that's what we've done in this wine. Now, it does 2 things. So there's two problems when we're aging a wine. The first one is a fruit level. So imagine I have a wine and the fruit level's here. And as we age that wine, the fruit level is slowly dropping and the savory level is slowly increasing. And the premium drinking is probably about here when they're in balance. And that might be 10, 20 years. So if I'm trying to make a wine that's going to last 50 or 100 years, I need to start with either a high level or a very stable level of fruit. So in 100 years, we end up here at our balance. So that's our first problem, is the fruit problem. The second problem is a structural problem. So imagine I've got a bottle of wine, and in that bottle of wine, I've got 100 tannins, and they're short chain tannins. So when you have a young Cabernet, underneath the tongue, it kind of has that chalky, edgy sort of tannin. Well, they're a short chain tannin. And when we age a bottle of wine, those short tannins join into a long chain, and a long chain is nice and soft and velvety. So that's one of the good things that's happening when we age a wine. So let's imagine I've got a bottle, and in that bottle, I've got 100 short tannins. And as I age that wine, those 100 tannins, they join together. So we've got 50 tannins, and we age it a bit longer and they join together, and we got 25 beautiful long tannins. So we've got 25 of these beautiful, soft, velvety tannins in this wine. The problem is 25 is not enough. And the whole structure of this wine falls apart, and it goes through a process that we call cracking up. And if you've ever tried an old wine that's cracked up, it is the best description for the wine. How wine sort of fills your mouth? It does that. So you fill your mouth with all this flavor and complexity, but then you pull it apart and you end up with right down the middle of the tongue, this sort of zigzag of, it just tastes like acid and water. So you got flavor out here and flavor out here, and then the zigzag of acid and water in the middle. And that's called cracking up. And I remember the first time I tried a cracked up wine, I'm like, this is the best description for a cracked up wine. Like, it feels like a crack has formed in the middle of the palate. So this technique of post-ferment maceration solves these problems. You got all the skins and seeds in a tank for 12 to 18 months. So you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of these short chain tannins floating around the tank, which pushes them together into a long chain tannin, a more stable tannin. So when I bottle this wine, I'm bottling it with 100 long, stable tannins rather than 100 short, unstable tannins. And so that solves that structural problem. The fruit problem, I actually have no idea how the French figured this out, because it must have been some crazy winemaker who'd forgotten to bottle a tank or something. He's like, oh, sacre bleu, I forgot this bottle. And so then he's bottled it later, or she's bottled it later and put it in a bottle, and it's worked out phenomenally, because at no stage when you use this technique does the wine taste fruity. Now, every other winemaking technique I use, and I've been experienced to, you taste the flavors as you go. So one day I'll come in and I'll taste all the passion fruit, and another day I'll come in and I'll taste all this grapefruit, and the end result is sort of an amalgamation of all these flavors during the process. When you taste this, there's no fruit flavors. And the first time I tried this technique was in 2015. And I remember coming out to the winery at around about that 3 months on skins, and come out and I took a sample from the tap and I smelt it and I tasted it. I thought, oh my God, I have completely ruined this wine. It tastes absolutely disgusting. I started calling some winemaker friends and some mentors in the industry. Guys, have you tried this technique? Tell me what happened. And they all said the exact same thing. They all said, yes, we tried it. We got to 3 months. It tasted terrible. But Jeff, don't worry. We pressed it off. We put it into oak. We were able to blend the flavor out in the end. So don't worry. So everyone in Australia was telling me to press it off. A couple of my mates in France, they said, no, you just have to leave it. So I decided to leave it. And I waited 12 months. It really wasn't that much better. And I waited 18 months. And I could taste that the tannins had polymerized. So they went from those edgy tannins under this tongue to these nice dusty tannin on top of the tongue. And so they'd form those long chains. But it had no fruit flavor. So we pressed it off, put it into oak, and then I put it in oak for 18 months. And I remember bottling it the first time. And I remember thinking, am I going to be able to sell this wine? You know, it's got great tannin structure, but it's got no fruit flavor. You know, it just tastes like skins and seeds. And what am I going to do? I've already got the bottles. I've already started bottling it. I might as well just bottle it and we'll just work out what we're going to do later. I don't know. So I bottled it. And then about 18 months later in bottle, out of nowhere, was just this explosion of fruit. These really intense capsicum, cassis characters. And I now taste that 18. Sorry, that was the 15. So I now taste the 2015 wine, which is, what are we now, 23 so far, eight-year-old wine. And I would tell you it's a 2-year-old wine. That fruit level is just staying there. It's not going anywhere. It's incredible. So I have no idea why it's doing that, but this technique's working. So I love it. I asked around Australia. I've not met anyone that's used this technique more than about 3 months in Australia. So in theory, this wine should age 100 years. I say in theory because we don't know. It works with grapes from France. We have not tried it with grapes from Australia. So in 50 years' time, we can get back on Zoom and I'll tell you, or back onto a recorded session, and we can experience, and I'll tell you if this technique works or not. So far, I'm really excited because it's doing exactly what I expect it to do. That fruit's holding in there. It's got this beautiful complex tannin structure. So it should age and age and age and age and age. So I'm really excited about this wine. It's already drinking beautifully now. You know, for me, the 15 was a little bit too on that capsicum side. So I wanted a bit more cassis. So I ripened the grapes about 3 weeks more for 2016. When you ripen the grapes, it also ripens the tannin structure, and the 16 didn't work. The tannins became too long and they fell out of suspension, and the wine was a bit too soft. So in 2017, we ripened it probably about 2 weeks more than 15, about 1 week less than 16. I reckon we've hit the nail on the head. We've got that beautiful balance of that cassis, bit of a little hint of capsicum, but it's doing that nice tannin structure that we want. So I'm really excited about the 17. But who knows? We'll see in 100 years' time, I guess. I can tell my children or my grandchildren that this was a great idea. So that's our Post Mac Cab Sav. Now, I lied earlier. We are going to need to rinse our glass out. The last one. And this is something quite special. So I mentioned before that we can no longer make our noble Pinot Gris. And I thought that I would include it in our virtual tastings because, you know, we made a lot of it in the first 4 years of converting biodynamic, and we can't make it since then. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen botrytis on the vines. Google it. You'll see that it looks awful. It's like a fungal disease that covers all the grapes in this furry mold, grey looking furry mold. And the story is, and I have not fact checked this story, but it's a great story. So someone told me once, don't let the truth get in the way of a good story or something like that. Anyway, so the story I've heard is that there was this king that owned this block of grapes, and that the people weren't allowed to harvest the grapes until the king said it's time to harvest. And the king got sick and they got this disease in there, and then the king got better and he said harvest it, and so they kind of panicked and harvested it all and made it into this wine, and they've got the result of this amazing, beautiful, syrupy golden syrup. And that was the birth of noble wine. So I don't know if that's true, but it's a great story anyway. But when we take a ton of normal grapes and we press it, we get about 500 liters of wine. When we take a ton of noble rot or botrytis grapes and press it, we get about 100 liters of juice. So it's really concentrated, and it's concentrated in a way that this fungal disease sort of shrivels the grapes up. But if I was to cut the grapes and shrivel them like a sultana, the flavor of the wine is like a sultana. But if I get botrytis and shrivel them with the botrytis, the flavor of the wine is more like a marmalade tin pineapple sort of character. And so we make this wine, we only get a small amount of it. And the history is that it used to get reserved for the noble families, which is why it's termed noble rot and noble wine. So we use Pinot Gris. So traditionally in Australia, it'd be Semillon or Riesling. I find that Pinot Gris has this nicer acid balance to it. Because it is slightly older, because it was only made during those first 4 years of going biodynamic, it's starting to get this nice strawy character to it, which you get when you age those sort of styles of wine. So I love this wine. It's a really great wine to end on. If you've got some blue cheese there, some really strong cheeses, this is a great match with those. I have this theory with dessert wines that we all have a bottle or two in our cupboard, and we're saving it for a special occasion. We never actually have a special occasion that we weren't opening them. So my advice is just open them and enjoy them. And so we hopefully will be able to make this again, but we haven't been able to for the last few years because our vines are too healthy now and we can't get botrytis. But I'm happy to have that problem. So guys, that's all the wines I have for you today. I really hope that you enjoyed the tasting. I hope that I didn't wobble on too long with my stories. I haven't done this for a while, so I'm a little bit rusty. Look, I would love you guys to please come visit us in Bowral if you're ever down this way. You should have some links. Please jump on our website, buy some wines. I'd love you to buy some wines. We have a wine club. So there's various levels of wine club. We did do an exclusive lifetime club where you can get wholesale prices for the rest of your life. We've stopped that. We are umming and ahhing about opening it again. We're trying to fund a new vineyard, expansion to the vineyard, and we thought this was might be a nice idea to do that. So stay tuned, join our newsletter, that sort of thing, because we'll keep you up to date with all those things. And guys, have a great evening or day or whenever you're tasting it. And hopefully we'll see you down here in the Highlands one day. And thanks very much for joining me. We'll see you later.